Here's the thing about modern art criticism. Somewhere between 1945 and today, a handful of influential critics figured out how to make us believe that ugly, confusing, or downright ridiculous artworks were actually profound masterpieces. They didn't do this through magic. They did it by wrapping terrible art in so much intellectual jargon that questioning it made you look stupid. The whole scam traces back to Immanuel Kant's ideas about aesthetic judgment. Kant argued that when we experience true beauty, it should be immediate and universal. Anyone should be able to appreciate it without special training. But post-war critics took Kant's philosophy and flipped it on its head. Instead of art being accessible to everyone, they made it so you needed a PhD in art theory just to get it. The American con artists. Let's start with Clement Greenberg, the godfather of this whole operation. This guy looked at Jackson Pollock's drip paintings, canvases that looked like someone had a paint-flinging tantrum, and declared them the greatest achievement in American art. How did he pull this off? Greenberg invented something called formalism, which basically said that painting should be purely about paint on canvas, nothing else. According to his theory, Pollock's seemingly random splatters were actually the logical endpoint of centuries of artistic evolution. The paintings weren't chaotic messes. They were sophisticated studies in pure optical space. Of course, you needed Greenberg to explain this to you, because it sure wasn't obvious just by looking. Then there was Harold Rosenberg, who came up with an equally ridiculous theory called action painting. He claimed these same drip paintings weren't about visual effects at all. They were existential dramas, with the canvas serving as an arena for action. So now, the same ugly paintings could be profound for completely opposite reasons, depending on which critic you asked. The beauty of the system was that the more confusing and ugly the art became, the more it proved you needed critics to understand it. When regular people looked at a Pollock and said, "My kid could do that," critics could smugly respond that clearly they just didn't understand the complex theoretical framework necessary to appreciate such sophisticated work. The European Sophisticates. European critics weren't about to let Americans have all the fun. They developed even more elaborate theories to justify terrible art, often mixing in politics and philosophy to make their arguments sound more important. Take Germano Clement, who promoted something called Arte Povera, literally poor art, which consisted of installations made from dirt, felt, and industrial junk. Clement claimed this wasn't just cheap materials thrown together, it was guerrilla warfare against bourgeois culture. Suddenly, the inability to afford proper art supplies became a revolutionary political statement. French critics brought in even heavier intellectual artillery, using post-structuralist theory to argue that traditional ideas about beauty and skill were just tools of cultural oppression. If you expected art to be visually pleasing or technically accomplished, you were obviously a reactionary who didn't understand how power structures operated in society. The institutional machine. The real genius of this system was how it became self-reinforcing through museums, galleries, and art schools. Critics didn't just write about art. They curated exhibitions, taught graduate students, and served on museum boards. They created a closed loop where their theoretical frameworks became institutional orthodoxy. Museums started collecting works based on critical reputation rather than visual appeal. Art schools began teaching students to create work that would generate interesting critical commentary rather than aesthetic pleasure. Galleries learned that they could sell pieces that looked like garbage as long as the right critics provided theoretical justification. The market followed suit. Research shows that in today's art world, critical reputation predicts auction prices far better than any visual qualities of the artwork itself. A banana duct taped to a wall can sell for millions of dollars because critics frame it as a profound commentary on commodification, not because anyone thinks it's beautiful. How they did it. The process was surprisingly straightforward, and it was pure marketing dressed up as intellectual discourse. First, a critic would discover an artist whose work initially seemed worthless or incomprehensible. Then, they'd write extensively about how this apparent worthlessness was actually evidence of deep conceptual sophistication that only trained eyes could appreciate. This was marketing 101. Create artificial scarcity and exclusivity, just like luxury brands that charge thousands for handbags that cost $50 to make. Critics created luxury understanding that only the culturally sophisticated could afford. They create elaborate theoretical frameworks explaining why confusion was actually the point. The work was challenging viewers' preconceptions or interrogating traditional aesthetic categories or deconstructing bourgeois assumptions about art. The more baffled regular people felt, the more it proved the work's theoretical sophistication. Think about it. This is classical marketing psychology. When Apple tells you that their new phone has revolutionary technology, you don't really understand what that means, but you want to be the kind of person who gets it. Critics did the same thing with art. They positioned aesthetic confusion as a marker of intellectual status. If you got the difficult art, you were sophisticated. If you didn't, you were just another Philistine. Museums would then acquire these works, lending institutional credibility to the critics. Exactly like celebrity endorsements in advertising. Art historians would write scholarly articles built on the original theoretical framework, creating what marketers call social proof. Students would learn these interpretations as established fact. Eventually, what started as one critic's opinion became accepted cultural truth, through the same mechanisms that turn marketing campaigns into cultural phenomena. The contemporary disaster. This system is still running today, probably more powerful than ever. Look at any major contemporary art exhibition and you'll find works that exist primarily as vehicles for critical interpretation rather than aesthetic experience. Conceptual art, installation art, video art, much of which films museums today, makes no sense without extensive theoretical explanation. The critics have won so completely that questioning their authority seems almost impossible. Suggest that maybe some emperor has no clothes and you'll be dismissed as unsophisticated, conservative, or just plain ignorant. The system has made aesthetic judgment itself seem naive and outdated. What we lost. The tragedy isn't just that we've been fooled into accepting bad art as great art. It's that we've lost confidence in our own aesthetic judgment. We've been trained to think that if we don't immediately see the profound meaning in a work, the problem must be with us rather than with the art. Kant's original insight was the aesthetic experience should be immediate and universal. Beauty should speak directly to anyone with functioning senses. The post-war critics destroyed this democratic vision, replacing it with a system where aesthetic value is determined by theoretical complexity rather than visual impact. But this pattern of manufactured confusion didn't stay confined to art galleries. The same mechanisms, using theoretical complexity to hide obvious problems, makes people doubt their common sense, creating expert classes who claim special interpretative authority, have spread through modern culture. In politics, we're told that obvious policy failures are actually sophisticated strategies we're too simple to understand. In education, clear thinking gets buried under layers of jargon that make basic concepts seem impossibly complicated. Students learn to distrust their own judgment and defer to theoretical frameworks that often obscure rather than illuminate. The art world was just a testing ground. Once critics proved you could make people accept anything by wrapping it in enough intellectual packaging, the technique spread everywhere. Now we live in a culture where common sense is constantly under attack, where ordinary people are made to feel stupid for trusting their own eyes and experience. The result is a culture where most people feel alienated from contemporary art, where museums display works that actively repel visitors, and where the very idea of beauty has become suspect. We've allowed a small group of critics to convince us that our natural aesthetic responses are worthless, and that true artistic appreciation requires surrendering our judgment to their superior theoretical understanding. The grotesque hasn't just been sublimated, it's conquered, and it's taught us all to doubt ourselves in the process.